Good evening. My name is Myra Gooden. I am the president of FLAIR, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. The mission of FLAIR is to create and sustain a network to promote and publicize research and education relevant to the contributions, lives, impacts, and lasting legacies of U.S. First Ladies. It's FLAIR's privilege tonight to present a program titled Edith Wilson, Overnight Sensation. We're joined by two distinguished contributors, historians, etc. Rebecca Boggs Robert and Heath Hardage Lee. Our program this evening is going to be done in an interview format. Heath will be interviewing Rebecca. And I'd like to share a little bit about both of these distinguished people before we begin. Rebecca Boggs Robert is an award-winning educator, author, and speaker, and is a leading historian of American women's suffrage and civic participation. Her books include the award-winning The Suffragist Playbook, Your Guide to Changing the World, Suffragists in Washington, D.C., the 1913 Parade and the Fight for the Vote, and Historic Congressional Cemetery. She is currently Deputy Director of Events at the Library of Congress and has previously worked as a journalist, producer, tour guide, forensic anthropologist, event planner, political consultant, jazz singer, and radio talk show host. Robert serves on the board of the National Archives Foundation, on the Council of Advisors of the Women's Suffrage National Monument Foundation, and on the Editorial Advisory Committee of the White House Historical Association. She will be interviewed by Heath Hardage Lee. Heath is an award-winning historian, biographer, and curator who specializes in women's history. Heath's narrative nonfiction book titled The League of Wives, The Untold Story of the Women Who Took on the U.S. Government to Bring Their Husbands Home from Vietnam, was published by St. Martin's Press in 2019. Heath's museum exhibition titled The League of Wives, Vietnam POW, MIA Advocates and Allies, about Vietnam POW and MIA wives, premiered at the Dole Institute of Politics in May of 2017 and traveled to venues all over the United States through 2023. The League of Wives is currently being developed as a television series. Heath also writes about women's history and politics for publications such as Time, The Hill, The Atlantic, and White House History Quarterly. His next book is biography of First Lady Pat Nixon, to be published in August of 2024 by the St. Martin's Press. It is a privilege to now present to you Rebecca Boggs Robert and Heath Hardage Lee. Ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Myra. And it's wonderful to see you, my friend, here tonight, right before Christmas. So Christmas and Hanukkah and all the holidays. So this hopefully is a nice break for people so they can put their feet up and listen to our First Lady dialogue. And I want to say how inspirational your book, Untold Power, has been to me as I am writing about Pat Nixon. It's a wonderful book. It's so full of so many great topics. So we're going to have trouble getting to everything we need to discuss tonight. I thought I would start off, just really go sequentially through and start at the beginning. If you could give us a little bit of background about Edith before she married President Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, Edith, the reason it's important to know who she was before she married Woodrow Wilson is because what she did when she was First Lady shouldn't come as a surprise if you were paying any attention at all. But the tricky part is most people weren't paying attention. Most people didn't focus on Edith Bowling Galt until she became Edith Wilson. And so the sources of what happened before 1915 are often down to Edith herself, and she was an unreliable narrator. So
Mhm.
what I could determine from both her and others is that she was born in 1872 in Whitfield, Virginia. Whitfield's in the little narrow southwest corner of Virginia. And her birthplace still stands. It's this funny kind of rabbit warren of rooms over storefronts on Main Street in Whitfield. And that was not the childhood she was taught she deserved. Her family had been tobacco planters in the James River area and had come down in the world after the Civil War. They had lost their property when they had to, pay their labor. And so she was raised on these very lost cause myths that they had had a much grander life before the Yankees took it all away. And the life they had was not especially grand. She was the sixth of 9 kids. There was this funny little arrangement of rooms, both grandmothers, mom and dad, aunts and cousins, various hangers on, house guests that overstayed their welcome. It was crowded in there.
And horrible
Canaries.
cages of canaries.
Lots
Right?
of canaries.
I remember that.
And you could definitely see where young Edith would be lost in that shuffle in, sort of Reconstruction era Virginia, that a mere daughter of a family with not a lot of means might have fallen through the cracks. But both of her grandmothers lived with her, and one grandmother who, as far as I can tell, was totally terrifying. Edith describes her as, wearing the old-fashioned Civil War hoop skirts and having this brooch of human hair and sat in a rocking chair with the tan skin of a dead dog on the back of it. I mean, so gothic and creepy. But that grandmother singled Edith out and told her she was special and told her she was smart and strong and fierce. And that was not a message a lot of girls were getting in that era. And in fact, was not the message Edith was getting from the other grandmother who also lived with them. And the other grandmother, her mother's mother, and her mother herself, was definitely reinforcing that, cult of true womanhood. Women should be pious and submissive and domestic. So I think that explains a lot about Edith, actually, that by nature, she was much more bent towards that fierce, independent confidence, but she was being told she had to pretend those things weren't true and cloak it all in this kind of hyper feminine, submissive, it was actually a man's idea mythology.
Right.
And you sort of see her do that time and again. But she was fierce and independent. She got out of Whitfield. She came here to Washington, married a man named Norman Galt, who ran the fancy jewelry store here in town. When he died and they were childless, she inherited the store, but she kept it, ran it, became this sort of independent woman of means, which was a fairly rare breed in the early part of the 20th century. She had her own money. She didn't need a chaperone. She had control of her own property. And she was really good at it. She was very fashionable. She became the first woman in Washington to get a driver's license. And she tooled around town in a little electric car. And she was a person of substance here in town in, turn of the century Washington. And that's who caught the eye of President Wilson.
Yes, very beautiful, very stylish. So yeah, she definitely seemed
really good jewelry, as you might imagine, from
good
someone who inherited a jewelry store.
Always really important. So, and her own jewelry from her own store, not from, a state gift. So, wow. Well, tell us a little bit about Edith and Woodrow's courtship in the spotlight, essentially how she became an overnight sensation.
So she was a reluctant presidential girlfriend. Wilson's first wife, Ellen, who was, the mother of his children and the one who had come up through politics with him and had moved to Washington with him when he was elected in 1912 and inaugurated in 1913. She died in 1914 while he was in the White House. And he was, by all accounts, heartbroken. The fact that he moved on so quickly is not any undermining of his love for Ellen. Right. But he was really bad at being alone. And Edith was great at being alone. And she was, enjoying tooling around town in her electric car and wearing fabulous hats. And they had a mutual friend. Wilson's doctor, Carrie Grayson, was a friend of Edith's. And he engineered them meeting. And Edith could kind of see it coming and was hesitant about it. But the president was so smitten at first sight. I mean, really just done for,
Yeah.
that he, throughout the spring and summer of 1915, just launched such a full frontal assault on her emotions. And the love letters survive. They are amazing. You get like a little bit blushy and embarrassed reading them 100 years later.
Yeah.
Not hers. Hers are very practical and funny, but his are racy. And
Yeah.
so he's writing to her from the very beginning. I mean, he does not hide his emotions for a single second. Right after he meets her, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever met, and you're the ideal female form, and I want to kiss your eyelids, and I dream about you, and she's writing back.
Funny.
That's lovely. Thank you. But I want to talk more about William Jennings Bryan. Do you think he's going to resign as Secretary of State? Who do you think is going to take his place? And he'll write, I saw you at the White House when you had tea with my cousin, and I snuck into the green room to spy on you through the lace curtains, and how clever of you to sit where I could see you. He'd write back, okay. You know what? Your last letter back to the Germans about the sinking of the Lusitania was really not your best work, and you should have had me edit it. So the courtship was just confounding if you only know these public people, right? I mean,
Right.
Wilson's reputation was this moralistic, black and white, superior intellectual, sure of his own righteousness to the point of priggishness. And he's writing mash notes.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. And she, was known as this sort of society, up from the country, no formal education. And she's writing sophisticated political analysis. And that's what goes on through the summer of 1915.
What's the total time that they court? Remind me, how long is this process?
Well, they met in March,
Mhm.
and he proposed 5 weeks later. She turned him down,
Right.
but they kept courting through the summer, and it was pretty secret. I mean, I think there were plenty of people in the know, because once he finally realized that she wanted to talk politics, he didn't stop with the kiss your eyelids stuff, but he started sending, along with his love letters, big packets of information like diplomatic correspondence and legislation and letters from cabinet secretaries, so that she could know his stuff and study up. And he taught her his cipher so she could decode his diplomatic correspondence. It was, yeah. So that all went through the summer of 1915. And she was so reluctant, even after she decided he was okay and maybe she could marry him. She was so reluctant to be first lady that she told him she'd only marry him if he lost re-election in 1916. And he seems to have only heard, I'll marry you, and not the
selective hearing.
Yeah. So by fall of 1915, he was telling everybody they were engaged, and they got married that December.
Wow. That is fast. Very
Yeah.
fast.
Yeah. I mean, Ellen died August of 14. He met Edith March of 15. They were married by December of 15.
Well, and the public did have problems with that, as I recall, because it was not politically, the optics were not good with that.
Yeah, I mean, Ellen was not a particularly beloved or famous first lady. She was academic and a little bit mousy, but they had been married for over 30 years. And there were people who felt that his, very public romance was a little unseemly. But also think about it, Heath. I mean, you know this history, right? The 19th Amendment hadn't been ratified yet, but states were enfranchising women, especially in the West. And so by the 1916 election, there were a fair number of women in the electorate. And so Wilson's advisors were worried that the women voters would hold it against him, that they would see him as disloyal to Ellen.
Makes sense to me. Sure.
Yeah, it did not play out that way. In fact, he barely won re-election in 1916. It was a total squeaker. But the state that put him over the top was California, and California was a women's suffrage state. So,
okay, now that is interesting. I didn't realize that. So so it didn't really affect him too much. But yeah, I would have been worried if I were his campaign advisor. So
yeah, and they came up with a banana scheme to leak fake letters from a former girlfriend. There was a lot of conniving behind the scenes to try to play it out. None of it worked. It was all.
Well,
Yeah.
just, just sounds very contemporary in a lot of ways.
For sure.
Oh my goodness. Well, so once she does become first lady, she's confronted with, what we've both dealt with in our work is this role, this sort of undefined role that each first lady defines a bit for themselves. So how would you say Edith at this time, what does the role look like when she comes in, and how does she herself put her stamp on it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure that there has been a flair program yet where someone doesn't say the role of first lady is bonkers, right? It
Yeah.
is this
Yeah, it
job
is.
without a job description. It is very public, and yet there are no repercussions, right? You can't be fired. You're not elected, but you are expected to be political. And you're sort of expected in some way. And, Rosalind Carter was so interesting about this. So reading all of
Mm,
her obituaries, that
yeah,
you're expected to reflect sort of American womanhood in some way.
right.
And that's a moving target, right? So
Oh
what
my
can you
God,
learn
yes.
from your predecessors if American womanhood keeps changing and evolving? And,
Wow.
1915 to 1920, when Edith had it, it was
Mm,
changing in almost real time.
right, right.
Um, so before Edith, there had certainly been first ladies who were well known, and there were ones who were famous for being stylish, like Frances Folsom Cleveland. There were ones who were known for being their husband's closest advisors, like Dolly Madison. There were ones who were known for having an influence on Washington, like Helen Taft. Like there were
Mhm,
definitely first ladies who had made a name for themselves,
mhm.
but it was local. There were very few people who really kind of knew the first lady outside of Washington, and certainly outside of the country, not known at all. No first lady had ever traveled abroad while first lady.
Yes. Yep.
Um, but when World War I ended in 1919, and Wilson decided to go in person to negotiate the peace treaty in Paris, uh, Edith went with him, and they were gone for the better part of 6 months. I mean, they were really gone.
Yeah.
Um, and as you might imagine, it was by far the biggest news story anywhere, everywhere. And
Mhm.
so there's the first lady, on the front page of every paper, staying at Buckingham Palace, getting the key to the city, hobnobbing with Italian royalty, elevated to the international stage in a way that had just never happened at all. And
Mhm.
Edith didn't take on any causes. She didn't give any interviews. She was not somebody who shaped the role in terms of political influence in a public way, but just the very nature of her visibility elevated the role.
Mm, mhm.
And it was in Paris where everybody started to realize she was a back channel to him, that they could
Mm,
take their problems or their questions, and that she would make their message palatable to him and get an answer back. A
yes.
role almost every first lady has played, but no one
Yes.
really knew what to expect from Edith because she showed up overnight.
Right. Right. Perfect. Yeah, that's so different. Yeah, thinking about that, all the papers, all and how stylish and how graceful she was. She seemed to get quite a good reception, particularly in France. So
They
good for
loved
the
her.
image.
And also, Wilson was shy, and he
Mhm.
was
Mhm.
self-conscious, and he hated being seen to do something that was not quite right. He was very invested in protocol and manners and making sure that rules were followed. And so he'd hold himself back out of fear of doing it wrong. And Edith didn't care. Like, Edith had barreled her way into every situation she had ever been in. She didn't know how to run a jewelry store. She did that. She didn't know,
Yes.
how to drive a car. She did that. She didn't know how to be first lady. She did that. And so
Right.
she'd, show up at dinner at Buckingham Palace and say, "Hey, are we wearing gloves to dinner? Can someone tell me?"
I love that about her. She's very
Right. Me
hands-on
too.
learning, and not embarrassed about that.
And it made it so much easier for him.
Yes, yes. She made him very comfortable. It seemed to make him relax in ways that maybe Ellen, no shade on Ellen, but she was so similar to him, and Edith is so different. So maybe brought out a little bit of a different side.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
yeah. Well, she was initially, I know you said, very reluctant to take on that role. And can you explain a little more about that reluctance? Like what was it that she wasn't afraid of new situations, clearly, but what was it that turned her off a little bit and made her try unsuccessfully to keep him at an arm's length?
I think she had a whole lot to lose. I mean, think about her life in 1915, right?
Mhm.
Um, she was in her late 30s. She was independent, running this business, living alone. Um, had her late husband's father been alive, had they had children, had his brother not been an invalid, had there been some man, you know, getting in the way of her inheriting the business or running it, it would have been a very different story. But instead, she had money and she had her own control over money.
Mm.
And women just didn't have that
Yeah.
in that day. You know,
Yeah.
finally, by the turn of the century, the Married Women Property Acts had passed every state. And so women could actually keep their own property. But it had been only like 10, 15 years since that had happened. And so the fact that she could um, be beholden to no one
Mm.
and travel the world and, you know, buy fashionable clothes and just do things on her own time in an era where women like her were trained that, you know, your role was to completely subsume yourself to a man if you were to be married.
Right.
It was an awful lot to give up for anybody, but it sure was a lot to give up for the very, very public role of first lady.
Mm.
And
Wow.
I I think she just knew what she had to lose. And the fact that she ultimately said she'd marry him if he lost, actually find really telling, because people ask me sometimes if she loved him. And I actually
Yeah.
do think she did.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, her initial letters were cold, but she came around. Her later
Yes. She
letters were
warmed up.
quite affectionate.
Yes.
And I don't think she would, even though I don't think she loved her first husband much. I
Yeah.
don't think she would have married him without knowing exactly what was going on. So,
Yeah.
um, but I think that she didn't want to be seen as a social climber,
Mhm.
um, you know, not a gold digger because she had money and he had
Yeah,
nothing.
she
But
didn't need
you know,
that.
as she
Right.
said, I don't want people to think I'm marrying the office, not the man.
Ah, yes. That's an excellent answer. And yeah, what she had to lose was quite a lot. It's really pretty remarkable she agreed now that, when you lay
Right.
it out like that, it's like,
Especially for Woodrow Wilson, who, you
yeah,
know.
I mean, if he had been Daniel Craig, maybe, but Woodrow Wilson, who looks like a Puritan minister, and no, I don't get it, but whatever. I mean, no judgment. So what okay, now this is one thing, and you and I have talked a lot about this on the side. This was my issue with Edith that I'm still struggling with. Though she was such a modern, as we would say, new woman, really embodies this new woman sort of persona, independent, has her own money, drives her electric car around town, but she is anti-suffrage. Thus, the conflict, the grandmothers you talk about, that was so interesting to these conflicting sides of her that are pulling at her. Why was that so? Why was she so anti suffrage at this point?
Oh, I wish I knew for sure. All I can do is kind of piece together different points of view. And there are a lot of different theories about this. You and I have talked about it. I think,
Mhm.
you know, there's some theories that maybe it wasn't the vote that she was against, it was the tactics of the movement.
Ah,
And
right.
that was certainly true by like 1917 when the National Women's Party was picketing the White House and very
Yeah.
directly criticizing Wilson. And she really hated that. She took that very
Yes.
personally.
Yep.
But there are signs that she was anti before that. In the time when she was a widow and was traveling to Europe a lot, she tells a story in her memoir, which is delightful, by the way.
It is.
She tells a
It's a great
story that
movie.
she and her friend Altrude, who ultimately
Mhm.
married Mary Grayson, were going to the Tower of London because Altrude's cousin Pat, who sounds terrible, was with them, and Pat had never been. But Edith had been to the Tower of London a bunch. And you know how when you're traveling with people and they want to see a site that you've already seen. You sometimes say like, I'll go get a cup of coffee. I'll meet you. Right. So
Definitely.
that's what she tried to do. She wanted to like settle in the shade in front of the Tower of London and let them go see the crown jewels. And she was going to get some letters written. And this is like 1912, 1913. And a guard came up to her and told her she had to move along because Emmeline Pankhurst and the British suffragettes had been starting to use militant guerrilla tactics, and prominent landmark like the Tower of London was considered a target, and unaccompanied women with a bag full of stuff were suddenly suspicious. And he told her she couldn't sit there, and searched her bag, and she was horrified. And she was horrified to have been associated with those rabble-rousing suffragettes. She was horrified that, this well-dressed, wealthy white woman was suspect of anything. And there was something classist about not wanting to be part of that movement. And I think there was just something a little not nice about the suffragists,
Yes. Radical for her.
Yeah. Too out there, too public, too sticking your head above the crowd. And that just went against her early training. And I think it had very little to do with the franchise. Actually, I think it had just much more to do with being vocal in public. And, she could have, by the time she was First Lady, there were plenty of fancy society ladies in the suffrage movement. If she had wanted social cover, she could have had it. But she never, ever did. I will say she voted as soon as she could.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? So interesting. So many conflicts but I mean, that's how everyone is. There's so many complicated pieces. It doesn't always line up exactly. But I think what you said about her upbringing, I live, as you know, very close to Wytheville. I'm in Southwest Virginia. I mean, and I think back at that time, particularly, it was, these suffragettes were the radical far, far left. They were militant and loud and pushy. And this is just horrifying to well-bred Southern women at that time. So it makes sense, but, it's your own ox that's being gored here. So it's interesting. Right. She did take advantage of the voting. It wasn't like she skipped it when she could vote.
Right.
So
for sure.
She's a tough one to reconcile on that, but you did a great job in the book.
Well, she's a real life human being, as all historical figures are. It should be much less interesting if she were predictable and, cut and dried.
Edith is never boring. Like you
boring. That is
she is never boring. You were not bored writing this book. So that's the most important. So, now, the subject of so many books, documentaries, etc., and your book as well, Edith is sometimes called America's first female president. And I bet a lot of people have no idea about this. So you give us the whole down low on that scenario.
So if anybody knows anything about Edith Wilson, it is this one chapter. So in 1920, or 1919 first, when they came back from Paris, they had been there negotiating the peace treaty. It was time for the treaty to be ratified by the Senate, and the Senate was pushing back. The Democrats had lost both the House and Senate in the 1918 midterms. And throughout the summer of 1919, the president and the Senate were at an impasse, particularly over the League of Nations and including the League of Nations in the treaty. The president decided, now remember, this is an age before any mass media, right? He couldn't go on the radio and plead his case. He decided what he had to do was take a train tour around the country and convince the voters of the righteousness of the League of Nations. They would then lean on their elected officials and it would all be fine. It was a terrible idea.
Horrible
idea. It was a terrible idea because he was already pretty sick. I mean, he had gotten quite sick in Paris. It was 1918. He had gotten the flu.
Right.
And he had never been the most robust specimen to begin with. And Paris was exhausting and grueling. And You don't take a sick, exhausted man and put him on a train in 100-degree heat and truck him around the country and have him give dozens of speeches a day and shake hundreds of hands. It's a total recipe for disaster.
Yes. Completely not smart. Mm-mm.
Everybody knew it was a disaster. His doctor, Carrie Grayson, Edith, his chief of staff, Joe Tumulty, they all tried to convince him not to do it. He kind of loved the idea of being a martyr for the cause. If he collapsed, right. So they couldn't stop him.
Mm-hmm.
So they went with him. And it was just as bad as everyone thought it would be. Guess what? So the train tour went all the way west, down California, was coming back. And in Colorado, he was getting sicker and sicker every day, and he collapsed.
Yeah.
The rest of the train tour is canceled. The train goes speeding back to Washington. He was kind of better enough when the train got to Union Station that he could wave to the crowds. It's taken to the White House and is put to bed. A week later, we're now early October 1919. He suffers a massive stroke.
Mm-hmm.
He was at death's door for several days. I mean, really, his life hung in the balance.
Mm-hmm.
Even after he was out of, immediate mortal danger, his whole left side was paralyzed. His speech was very slurred. He would lose concentration and be sort of unable to follow a conversation. He slept a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, the treatment for stroke was total rest, right? You were told you couldn't be stressed. You couldn't face bad news. You couldn't be handed a difficult decision. Your mind was meant to be easy to recover. Well, what does a president do, right? A president faces bad news and makes hard decisions.
Yes.
And,
very tough not to do that.
You can't, even if his mind were perfect after the stroke, and it's pretty clear it wasn't.
Yeah.
He was being told not to use it. He was being told not to do what he was elected to do.
Mm.
So in Edith's retelling, the doctors went to her and said, if he does everything he was elected to do, he's going to die.
Mm-hmm.
But he can't quit because the only thing keeping him alive is this dream of the League of Nations. So if he quits, he'll also die.
Oh, what a horrible position for her.
Right? And yes, if he dies, we'll never have world peace because the League of Nations is the hope for the future.
No pressure.
Right. No pressure. So Edith decided the only option available to her was to do his job for him until he was better enough to do it himself.
Wow.
And so starting from October of 1919, with the complicity of Dr. Carrie Grayson and Joe Tumulty, they lied to the public, the press, the Congress, the cabinet, the president himself. He never knew how sick he was.
Right.
The vice president, everybody. They lied to everybody. They never said how sick he was. They said he was just fine and he was recovering. And in the meantime, Edith did everything. So anytime somebody had a question for the president, they took it to her. She pretended to take it to him. It's pretty clear she did not always.
Right.
She made decisions about who got to see him. She made decisions about cabinet officers and personnel. She made decisions about legislation. She wrote statements for the public to the degree that anybody was the chief executive of the nation from October 1919 through the spring of 1920. Edith Wilson was the chief executive of the nation. That's why she's called the first woman president.
And not that she wasn't very smart and capable, but her education, as you say in the book, was minimal at best, would you say? Like,
and also no one elected her to anything.
And she's not the elected official. It's like, what is going on here? It's
the American people had wanted to have her in that position, regardless of her education or whatever, that would have been fine. But there is somebody elected to take over when the president is incapable of doing the job. That person is not the first lady.
Right.
And the vice president.
Right. And explain, at this time, there was also not a succession plan. That was much later that I learned from your book that
there was no 25th Amendment.
Yeah. There was nothing there.
So there is some language in the Constitution that specifies that the vice president takes over, but it's very vague and it doesn't say whether he becomes acting president or actual president. And more to the point, it doesn't say who determines
Mm.
that the president is incapacitated. And so anybody who might have, say, his doctor or his wife or his chief of staff, was not going to.
Yeah.
It is also true that the vice president wanted no part of it. The vice
Mhm.
president was a guy named Thomas Marshall, completely forgotten to history, kind of a
Yes.
clown. He was sort of the court jester of the Wilson administration.
Yeah.
So he was not exactly clamoring for the authority. So this went on. I mean, there were many things that shocked me when I started digging into this chapter, but the main thing was how long they sustained this conspiracy. I mean, it
Yes.
really was. He was not seen in public until April of 1920.
Unbelievable.
Not seen in public, not let alone like not speaking or taking questions from the press or whatever, literally not seen. And when finally there were enough sort of press attention saying, you know what, if he's okay, let us see him. And if he's not
Yeah.
okay, we need to know that.
Mhm.
They propped him up in a car and kind of drove him around town.
Yeah, I remember that. Just like he's at death's door and they're propping him up like a puppet to placate the
Yeah.
press.
They had to find a cloak because he couldn't get his left arm in the sleeve of a traditional coat. And they kind of wedged him into the corner of his car. And
It's terrible.
it is astonishing. The other thing that was astonishing is that the press was more curious than I'd given them credit for. I was like, where was the press? Because that's
Right.
what would happen now. The
Oh,
press
yes,
covered that in a
absolutely.
second. And there were articles suggesting that Edith Wilson was acting as president, and they
Mhm.
weren't all critical. Some of them
Really?
said, what a wonderful wife she is. Aren't we all impressed with how Mrs. Wilson has stepped up to the plate?
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
that's pretty progressive for that time period.
Uh-huh.
That's very interesting. Yeah, well, now, of course, we'd know every detail or, it's so different, obviously, with social media, with television, radio even, but you had nothing then. So you were going to just take what the White House said and believe it, I suppose.
I suppose, or if you were going to question it, you couldn't question it to very many people at a time. I mean, the 24-hour news cycle there wasn't even really a traditional White House reporter beat at the time that,
Right,
it was just
right.
so different.
So different. I know from my own research, yeah. I mean, there wouldn't have been, there was just no press pool dedicated to cover that. So very different time period. Well, and with Edith, some people, I'd love you to talk a little bit about along those lines about some people said, oh, this was Edith's plan and she wanted to take over and she wanted to be the president from the beginning, and your take was very different on that. So tell us a little bit about your take on your findings.
Yeah. This kind of gets to why I wrote the book, because I felt like existing biographies of her kind of reduced her to a stock character, and
Yes.
you had sort of your choice of stock characters. They didn't all reduce to the same stock character, but they were not especially nuanced pictures. And one was this kind of Lady Macbeth, that she'd seized power for her own agenda, and that
Right.
she was, hungry for the authority and stepped in for her own ends.
Yes.
I don't think that's fair. I think she enjoyed it more than she'd like to admit she enjoyed it. Back to the, I'm confident and strong, but I'm pretending I'm not part.
Right. Right.
And she did
Secretly,
write a
maybe.
whole memoir downplaying her own role in history, which, no man
Yes.
has ever done ever. Um,
It's true.
but the other candidates for stock character were also naive country mouse who was taken advantage of by conniving political men, which was
Yes.
also not fair. That's not who Edith was at all.
No.
And then the other one is this perfect wifely standing by her man thing.
Mhm.
And the trickiest part about that one is that she was the biggest proponent of that. She
Right.
was the one out there saying, I was just being the best Mrs. Woodrow Wilson I could possibly be, and I thought of my husband first and the nation next.
Right. Right. Impossible to reconcile all those different parts, but so interesting because I think you're right. I think she secretly did enjoy some of that, but it was not a diabolical plan to be
No.
president run the country. It was not premeditated. It was more born out of necessity, I think, and love for her husband. That
Yes.
she wanted to keep and didn't want him to be burdened or strained and then die. So, I mean, she was in a very tough position with that. But you
She
did a
was.
nice job talking about all the different things going on here that she had to manage.
Yeah, and let's be clear, she did have other choices open to her. Deciding to lie to everybody and keep the reins of executive power for herself was not the only path she could have chosen.
This is true. This is true. And then her memoir, which you mentioned, has just such a glossy take on everything. It's hilarious. Like, if anyone, I'm sure you would advise them, if they really want to have a good time, go read her version of events. It's very fancy.
Absolutely. But I have to say, so her memoir, she wrote a memoir in 1939, so years after Wilson's death. And she wrote it kind of in a rage because everybody in that administration wrote a memoir. Everybody in that administration wrote a memoir. And she was so annoyed by other people's version of events that she decided to set the record straight with her own. So it's totally, I mean, all memoirs are curated by the author, but she's had such an agenda that it is, while it is funny and frank and, colorfully written and totally worth reading, it is also at times like provably untrue.
Right.
And so
right.
you have to take it with lots of salt.
Lots of salt. Lots of salt. Well, I will ask one more question, and then I have a bunch of interesting questions coming up here for you from our other Flair members. But the last thing I would ask connects with the memoir, in that, so Wilson dies, and she has, and you'll have to remind me of the dates, but she has a extremely long period of living after he has died. And I would love you to tell us a little bit about post-presidency and then her life without Woodrow.
Yeah. So Warren Harding was elected in 1920. The only American who was surprised by Warren Harding's total landslide victory was Woodrow Wilson, because he still thought the nation was behind him because she was lying to him the whole time.
Right.
But no one else was surprised.
Right.
So they left the White House in the spring of 1921 when the Hardings were moving in, and they decided to stay here in Washington. They were the first couple to do that. Obviously, the Obamas have done it since. They bought a house on S Street, not far from the Obamas.
Yes, right.
And she knew that he was an invalid. She stopped pretending he was going to get better and bought a house that could have an elevator, and where she really knew he was never going to be okay again. And Washington was her home, and she knew she'd outlive him. So they moved there in March of 21. He died in January of 24. She lived till 1961.
That is amazing to me.
Yeah, she outlived him by 37 years. And she stayed in that house on S Street. It's now the Woodrow Wilson House. Absolutely worth a visit if you can get there. And she did a couple of things. She went back to being sort of a fabulous widow about town. She traveled a ton and, sent all of her nieces and nephews through school, and was kind of, beautifully dressed and fabulous.
Kind of Auntie Mame a bit.
Yeah, for sure. She also sort of appointed herself the keeper of first ladies. So any incoming first lady, regardless of party, she had them to tea. Wow. And it wasn't a come, kneel at the desk of the grand dame. It was really kind of, I know this job's weird. I'm here if you need me. And so they all came to S Street and had tea with Miss Edith. And then the main thing she spent her time with was burnishing his reputation.
Yes.
So she showed up at everything. Every time someone was unveiling a statue or naming a building after him, or, awarding a prize, she was there. And it's been so interesting to me, Heath, watching in the last couple of years as people have really kind of revised the reputation of Woodrow Wilson.
Right.
That the reputation we're revising, that myth of the visionary of global peace, is so much a myth of her making.
Oh, that's very interesting.
She really spent so much time and effort burnishing that persona and making sure that was his legacy.
So interesting, and again, I think she really did love him and think it was really important that that was her job to do so, right or wrong. Very devoted to his memory. So,
I agree.
well, let me get to some of these questions
Okay.
we have some interesting ones. Okay, this is a good one. So you said earlier Edith was an unreliable memorist. So her memoir, very unreliable. What are some examples you found a difference between her memoir and the historical record?
Yeah, there are many. Let me give you one. So, and this is one of those things where she lied where the truth would serve. So it makes you suspect of a lot of other things.
Uh-huh.
When she and Wilson were courting, and I told you there was this bananas plot on the part of some of his advisors to try to pretend there were letters from a former lover that might undermine him. And so it's too convoluted to get into. But
Yes.
suffice it to say, there were no letters and he knew they wouldn't be released, but he was worried the scandal would touch Edith and that wasn't fair to her because it had happened long before they met. So he went to her house on DuPont Circle and told her everything and told her that he would release her from their engagement.
Right.
She took the night to think about it. And then the next morning wrote him a letter that was actually quite romantic saying, I'm all in, not for duty, not for history, but for pure love, right or wrong. I stand by you. I'm ready to do it. It was this real turning point in their relationship.
Yep.
Those letters exist. She went to the White House. They, reconciled. They were so delighted in each other. And that was really kind of the moment when they went public with their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
In her memoir, for reasons known only to her, she says that the next morning she sent him this note, but she didn't hear back. And she didn't hear back for days and days and days. And 4 days later, Carrie Grayson came to her and said, you must come to the White House. He's at death's door. And she goes rushing to the White House and she finds him, as she describes, like a marble saint on his tomb, motionless. And, her loving touch revives him. And he says, could it possibly be you love me? And they have this sweet romantic scene. And then they get married. And later on their honeymoon, he pulls her letter out of the pocket of his dressing gown, still unopened. He had never had the nerve to see whether she had said yes or no. It's all fantasy, but it kind of lays the groundwork for his health relying on her presence and her, being the person who knows best what's going to make him better. So it's an easily disprovable story. The letters exist. The White House log shows that she visited the very next day. He was not sick for 3 days and, unreachable. It just.
That's so, sometimes too, I've found this in my interviews. I bet you have too, your research about different things, memories, they warp and change and shift over time. And so you wonder if maybe she even believed it because it had been so long in between that time, like she had romanticized it. I mean, that, it could be, I find that so often I'll compare one account to another account and be like, you two have totally different memories of whatever this is, completely different. And it's so bizarre how the mind changes things. So it could be that, but we also know that Edith liked to put the best possible spin on things. So maybe that is even more romantic than what happened. I don't know, or a combination, who knows?
Yeah.
But my memoir is great reading. You should have whatever drink Edith liked to have, sit down, read that sucker.
Bourbon.
Bourbon. Thank you. I should have asked that right away. That's very important. What did she like to drink? Bourbon. I'll remember that. Well, let's see. We had a couple of other questions. And you did talk a little bit about this. How involved was Edith in President Wilson's work before Paris, before she went with him? Like, what was maybe that trajectory of her involvement with all, the ciphers and learning everything? A little refresher would be great on that.
Yeah, that part surprised me. I think in part because of that naive country mouse, no formal education persona that was out there in some of the biographies. She was involved from the very beginning. So the very early letters include quite sophisticated analysis and questions about his work. And he responded in kind. He was not patronizing about it at all. And I think that actually explains the allure quite a lot. I think Edith, again, psychoanalyzing someone 150 years after their birth is not fair, but I think she was probably told she was beautiful every day of her life. And she was probably not told she was smart that often.
Yes.
And here was the leader of America, a famous intellectual, telling her that he relied on her judgment and wanted to know what she thought. That must have been pretty heady stuff.
Yeah, that was the aphrodisiac, not the eyelid kissing, right?
Not the eyelid kissing. Exactly. So I think that she also became quite protective of his attention, and she started to undermine his other advisors. She really did not like Colonel House.
Yes.
She never warmed to Joe Tumulty, although they found a useful alliance later on. So she was his closest advisor, and he trusted her judgment from the very beginning. And Ellen had played that role too. I don't know that she shaped his agenda in any demonstrable way. I think she knew his mind pretty well. If anything, she just sort of let him find his way to the answer that she knew he was headed towards by asking the right questions and supporting him in his judgment. And I think this question then comes up, if she was already an insider, if she was already someone that he trusted, that other people trusted, what did she do with that power when she had it in 1919? Did she affect political history in some way? And I don't think she did anything differently than he would have done. I think she knew his mind pretty well. But the fact that she was keeping him in the dark and not letting him hear any bad news and telling him that, the nation was still behind him and was desperate for the League of Nations and the Senate was going to ratify it any day now, which was, completely wrong.
Right.
Meant that he had really bad information. So
right.
I think the way she affected political history is she warped his judgment, so even if he were making decisions, which he clearly wasn't all the time,
right,
his information was bad because he didn't know what was going on because she wasn't telling him.
Yeah, that's a great analysis. I think that's true. And then so many things like the letters, I remember, studying a little bit about like all the letters at the post office. There were like so many things she never showed him that just like literally were never opened. So, I mean, imagine what could have been in there, that lack of information. You're right. I'm sure, obviously his judgment was completely warped by the end. Our last question, I'm going to hand it back to Myra. Did Mrs. Wilson ever reverse her position on suffrage?
So all she did was use the vote. So if she never reversed her public position, she certainly enjoyed the franchise. So in 1920, the first year she could vote, she voted absentee as a New Jersey voter because that's where he was registered. And then she changed her registration here to DC. And so she gave up the right to vote for president because we DC voters did not have that right until after her death. So she, but she voted in every election, and she never came out and said anything publicly about, I was wrong. Women are actually responsible voters and deserve to have their, civic rights, but she sure exercised them.
Very interesting. What a fascinating First Lady. So complex, so interesting. And your book is absolutely fabulous. So everyone needs to read it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And thank you for having this conversation. It was such a treat to see you and hear some more about Edith. So I'll hand it back to Myra to wrap up.
Thank you, Heath. And I want to concur with what you've just said. This was an entertaining and fascinating discussion. I am still laughing about the role of First Lady is bonkers. I just,
So well said.
wonderful. But on a more serious note, I thought particularly, Rebecca, your discussion of memory had so much to it, and I wish that we had more time to explore that. I found that in my own research with people that I interviewed who had very different memories than others. So I thought that was an excellent point that you made. So tonight we've had the pleasure of this interview, and Rebecca's book is titled Edith Wilson, Untold Power, The Fascinating Rise and Complex Legacy of First Lady Edith Wilson. This is the final Flair program of 2023. We will be back in 2024 with other ways to explore this bonkers role and continue perhaps looking at memory. I want to thank Heath and Rebecca. Thank you so much. This has just been such a treat. And to everyone who's watching, happy holidays, no matter what it is that you celebrate, and certainly a healthful and happy 2024. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.